This is the Brave Ideas Podcast, brought to you by Aqua. Welcome to episode 27 of the Brave Ideas Podcast, the show that is all about bringing to light fresh perspectives from the worlds of digital and marketing. I'm Dan Herman. I'm a digital strategist. I'm an early adopter who appreciates unfunny jokes. And I'm here today with my co-host.
I'm Esther McGeer, Head of Conversation Analytics at Aqua. The honey badger is my spirit animal, and I never brush my hair.
Today, we are super excited to have Nelson Freitas, Chief Strategy Officer at Wunderman New York, with us on the show. Nelson is a fitness junkie who put Costa Rica on the map, and today he's going to talk to us about brands, empathy, and data. So Nelson, what's new?
Well, I want to talk about the intersection of brands, empathy, and data in kind of the modern world, and how to build brands that are sustainable through that kind of trifactor. And when I talk about that, I feel like brands currently do a lot of things, at least on paper or when they're talking, to be customer-centric, know more about people, engage people on their terms, have a two-way dialogue with people, engage with people, drive loyalty, but yet the way they behave is not being translated into the way they're talking. So when I talk about a brand having empathy, it's a very different way to think about how you engage consumers and how you learn about consumers.
So if I'm understanding what you're saying, what's really interesting is this idea that, brands today, they aren't really understanding what it takes to be sensitive to a consumer and to their needs. And as such, it's a big challenge that we face. I also just want to go back to this idea, in the topic, you've said data and empathy. And these are two very distinct concepts. Mm-hmm. How do they come together?
Well, I think that one of the ways that data, which in many instances can come across as, quite hard and rational, I feel like data is going to move to this place where it's really understanding the heart and soul of an individual. How do we use data to understand the heart and soul of an individual and get closer to them and what they're sensitive about and their silent desires versus just what's obvious about them?
So, Nelson, how do brands use data to connect with the consumer?
I feel like right now brands use data as demographically. I know your age, I know your gender, I know your ethnicity. I know all these things on, in terms of me looking at you. And then they understand a little bit of your attitudes, right?
Yeah. And
your psychographics. But rarely can they really, really isolate the things that I really like, which is typically the places they gravitate to, versus the things I'm truly passionate about and I can't live without. That's why they falter.
So how do we go about, as an agency, collecting that data? How do we go about doing that? Where do we discover these things about the people that we're serving our brands to?
I think it needs to be much more fluid and experiential. For instance, I feel like we still need to do the basics of demographics, psychographics, all those different things. But then I think we need to move to another layer of, okay, what actually are people doing in their spare time? And how do you disentangle what they just have to do out of chore and duty versus the things that they're actually doing that they truly, truly are passionate about? What communities are they engaging with? What communities are they not engaging with? In those places versus just a psychographic or attitudinal thing.
So Nelson, what I really love about what you're saying is that there's an opportunity with this explosion of data to really develop a strong understanding about who our consumers are, what their interests are, and where they come from, and that brands can start to manipulate that and use that in order to build relationships with them that position them in a different kind of space than where they've been before. And I think that what's really interesting for me about that is, I was at a conference today, and one of the stats that came out was that they discovered that 41% of South African families, where we come from, are single-parent families. And there's a massive opportunity to use data to understand the different spaces where people come from, the different contexts in which they develop and grow up, or the different struggles that families face. Can you share with us any examples of brands that do that really well?
This is a brand that I don't know if they've started doing it, but I remember talking to somebody and they were trying to do it. Like if you take a brand like Levi's, I remember working with Levi's, and one of their examples was around, I feel like right now, to get people to buy our products, we target them demographically. Okay, you're a teenager and you want this product, so I'm going to target you. Versus looking at our target in a completely different way, like, oh my God, you are passionate about rap music on the West Coast of the United States. So I'm going to, as a brand, immerse myself in communities, blogs, digital experiences, whatever that might be, to be able to speak to you in that context. Mm-hmm. Because if I'm speaking to you in that context, I'm speaking to something that is truly passionate about you and truly in the context of your life versus something that you're just doing. And I thought that was such an interesting way to kind of look at consumers in terms of the communities that I'm passionate about versus targeting me as a demographic.
I think it's so fascinating. What strikes me about what you're saying is that you're not talking really about advertising. You're talking about relationship building through understanding what people do. And the role of content in doing that is absolutely massive. I don't know what you think about that suggestion. What role does content play in answering that need to show empathy?
I think that that's pivotal. Like even when we're working with Coke, we're trying to constantly tell them, how do you use content to go above your product? How do you introduce new aspects of things that they're passionate about? Because Coke is obviously a big brand that can cast a wide net around music, culture, and different aspects. So how do you talk to people in those contexts versus just the context of your product and drinking your product?
Sure. So it's less about the physical state of the consumer, but more about the psyche behind it, the experience they're having in turn with the brand. To what extent do we allow that empathy from an actual brand point of view to affect our business? So obviously it will inform content is one of the things. Like how far do we go to allowing the consumer's psyche to affect what we're doing as a brand?
I think you have to allow it completely because it's this way. If you can't walk a mile in your customer's shoes, which in and of itself is showing empathy in a very holistic way, then how is it that you're going to engage with them? Never mind engage with them, but I'm reading new things about how consumers expect us to anticipate them. Just give me the things that I'm truly interested in. And if you can't really anticipate me based on your understanding of me of the past, then there's no empathy and there's no relationship and therefore there's no engagement.
How do brands start to approach this thing, if we've never tapped into the psyche or the empathy of our consumer before? Where do we start?
Yeah, I think we start with a more multifaceted picture of people. One, it's like the way we paint a multifaceted picture of our friends. We just don't know our friends' ages and race. We know the things that they love. We know the things that they dislike. We know the way they behave. We know the things that they don't behave. And we use different pieces of information to piece that together. It's not unlike what we should do with consumers. Like how do you use quantitative, qualitative, ethnographic, social data, and how do you integrate all that to create a complete holistic view of your consumer so that you can infuse those into the conversations that you have with them. Right?
Yeah, totally. And I love that the way that, we've spoken about data as a means of improving campaigns, looking at analytics to do that kind of stuff. But now we're moving into a space where data informs not only how we do marketing, but also how we shape our businesses to answer consumers. And what I find like almost frightening about what you're saying is that brands have to be prepared to completely transform on the basis of where the consumers are taking them.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. Like what you're saying is that you can't be afraid. You just got to let it happen. I mean, does that exist without limits? I mean, is a brand going to just go through the sausage machine and turn into something else at the end?
It's completely possible. So let me explain to you. I always try to explain this to clients. I almost feel like, let me put it into a human, everyday context.
Yeah.
It's like when you go to a party. Right? When you go to a party, if you're treating me as a mass person, which mass communication does, or if you just know my age and my gender and my ethnicity and a little bit about my attitudes, you walk into a room and there can be 10 people in that room and you're going to treat all those 10 people fundamentally the same. Yeah. Because I don't know anything about you, so how can I not treat you in the same? So you're going to make all these assumptions based purely on my age, the color of my skin, or a little bit about that I'm more liberal than conservative, which is a little bit what brands tend to know. Versus if I walked into that room and I knew intimately every one of those people, I can have a completely different conversation with each one of those people.
Yeah.
That was more personalized, more tailored, more connected to that individual versus just kind of assuming, making all these assumptions based on kind of somewhat superficial information. And I feel like that's exactly the world of marketing right now. You're either on the one end and you want to shift to the other end. Because if you don't shift to the other end, then you can't possibly think that you're going to cut through with consumers on an emotional level and build engagement and ultimately build loyalty.
I mean, I totally agree with you, and I think that we've got to get away from this one-to-many kind of approach and get into this hyper-personal way of talking to consumers. And it just brings me to another thing. We live in the age of disruption, right? Companies are being shifted, through Ubers, the Airbnbs, whole business models are changing. And I just wonder if a brand's business model is outdated or is encountering the kind of disruption that is challenging where they're going. Is empathy enough to make them relevant?
Yes. I think it is, because I feel empathy is fundamentally, I understand you and I've walked in your shoes and I can completely relate to your situation. Versus not. For instance, we've just done a campaign for Coca-Cola that's called Dude versus Diva. And there's this huge trend here with millennials that we found out just by really understanding millennials in a deeper way about the certain fluidity between genders. Like, I'm not purely male or female. I can fluidly borrow from both without being called something derogatory, because we have this huge thing in the United States with transgender and diversity and everybody accepting everybody. And we completed this campaign for Coca-Cola called Dude and Diva in cooperation with 7-Eleven, which is a convenience store. And it was all around how do you use gender as a way for millennials to have fun with their personality. So depending on the situation, you could either have a mustache or red lipsticks to predict, I feel more dude versus I feel more diva in a situation. And we had both genders playing to both things. Now that campaign probably 15 years ago wouldn't have worked. But now I think it works because I think we just know more about people in the sense that they're kind of okay experimenting with their gender. 10 or 15 years ago, we would have been very siloed in, you're either male or female and we're going to treat you as such. This was really about kind of blurring those traditional lines, which I think showed empathy, showed diversity, showed a certain amount of inclusiveness, and I think made us more interesting and more relevant.
I love this idea because, to Dan's point earlier, it's not necessarily about brands throwing away what they believe in or throwing away the entire business structure. It's actually something really, really simple. So it's actually just about, you walk into a room with 10 different people there, you see what the mood is, you don't become a different person, but you do adjust the way you speak, and you adjust perhaps the way you approach the situation, you adjust the way you come into the party. It's a really simple thing to apply, and it just makes a lot of sense in today's climate. If there was one thing, Nelson, that you would like to drive home for our listeners and the rest of our Wunderman network, what would it be around developing empathy and the brand experience?
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's a simple human concept. Every time you enter into a business challenge or a certain project on a client, the first thing to ask about the target you're going after is, how do I walk a mile in this person's shoes? And that typically is, how do I understand every ounce of this person, from who they are to what moves them and what they're truly passionate about, what they're afraid of, what they dream of, and all these different things, to as most nuanced perspective that you humanly possibly can. Because I think that's going to help the connection that you can make with this individual. If you're purely on the outside looking in, then I think there's never going to be a connection. If you actually walk in this person's shoes and you can look at yourself and say, okay, I've really walked in this person's shoes and I truly understand them, there's going to be a different connection.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nelson. So you've had the distinct privilege of being our first global guest on the Brave Ideas podcast.
Oh, wow.
And we're really excited that you were able to join us in this conversation. So Nelson, if people want to find out more about this topic or more about you, what do they need to do?
You can contact me at Nelson, Nelson, period Freitas, Freitas, at Wunderman.com.
Thanks, Nelson. And thank you for listening to the Brave Ideas podcast. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. And while you're there, give us a rating and a review.
For more awesome content, please visit the Brave Ideas blog, which you can find at aquaonline.com/Brave Ideas podcast. Also, if you want to get involved in the conversation, please follow at Aqua Brave Ideas on Twitter or Brave Ideas Podcast on Instagram.
If you want to keep in touch with me, Dan, you can connect with me at Elhermo, ELHERMO on Twitter, and Elhermo23 on Snapchat and Instagram. And you can get in touch with Esther.
You can email me at estherm@aquaonline.com.
Special thank you to Nelson Freitas, our guest. Thanks to Matthew Klebanski for music and production. Thanks to Johan Botha for the art direction. And to our distribution team, Nagesh Ramsamy, Kirsten Wiggle, Helen Semenis, and Sabelo Canida.
That brings us to the end of the show. We'll leave you with one final thought. There are no original ideas, only original people.